On June 12, at Munich Airport in Germany, a senior executive from a Chinese photovoltaic company was arrested by the German government shortly after disembarking from the plane. They were on their way to attend the Munich International Solar Technology Expo, the largest PV technology expo in the world. This scene reminded me of another incident that took place on December 1, 2018, when Huawei CFO, Meng Wanzhou, was arrested by Canadian authorities immediately after landing in Canada. These two events share a high degree of similarity, and behind them lies fierce industrial competition. Meng Wanzhou's arrest in Canada was due to Huawei's threat to US technological dominance, breaking the Western monopoly on communication technology. The arrest of the Chinese PV executive in Germany, on the other hand, was because Chinese PV companies have become too powerful. China's dominance in the global PV market far surpasses that of Huawei's 5G, and it can be described as invincible. Looking at the world as a whole, Chinese PV is a terrifying force without any competitors. All other countries in the world combined cannot match China alone. Let me provide you with some startling figures. First, in terms of technological patents, there are a total of 150,000 global PV technology patents, with Chinese companies holding 120,000 of them, accounting for 80% of all patents. Second, the top 10 PV companies globally are all Chinese companies, possessing comprehensive monopolistic advantages from raw materials to production equipment. What does that mean? It is equivalent to China simultaneously possessing leading-edge technologies throughout the entire chip industry chain, including chip materials, chip manufacturing, chip packaging, chip design, and lithography. Chinese PV has a market share of over 60% in the United States and reached a peak of 95% in the European Union, while the EU's domestic PV component capacity accounted for only 3%. So, how did Chinese PV achieve a breakthrough despite the containment by the US and the West? In order to support the domestic PV industry in the European Union, it has repeatedly suppressed Chinese companies. They set import limits, requiring that the import share not exceed 65% of the market share. In addition, they also imposed price controls on Chinese PV products, prohibiting them from being sold too cheaply and requiring them to be more expensive than local EU companies. However, these measures have not been able to hinder the rapid expansion of Chinese PV companies in the European Union. Soon, Europe introduced a harsher measure, anti-dumping investigations. Starting in 2012, the European Union launched anti-dumping investigations into Chinese PV products, and imposed punitive tariffs of 20% on Chinese PV imports in 2013. Later, the anti-dumping duty rate was raised to 47.6% by the EU. Under the political pressure from the EU, China's PV exports to the EU dropped by 78.5%. Without the support of China's PV industry, the EU's installed PV capacity plummeted. In 2012, the EU added 16.5 gigawatts of PV capacity, but by 2017, it was reduced to only 8.61 gigawatts. The development of PV energy in the European Union entered a stage of sluggish growth. Unable to bear the situation any longer, the EU lifted the punitive tariffs on Chinese PV products in 2018. By 2022, Chinese PV regained a rapid market share of 46% in the European Union. Why is the European Union unable to escape its dependence on the Chinese PV industry? The fundamental reason lies in economies of scale. The larger the scale, the lower the costs. PV energy is an industry extremely sensitive to costs. In order for PV generation to replace coal power on a large scale, its generation cost must be lower than that of coal-fired generation. However, the PV industry in the European Union is too small, which leads to massive upfront investments for European PV companies, while Chinese companies have already achieved economies of scale. As soon as European companies emerge, Chinese companies can use their price advantage to crush them. Just like ASML, a Dutch company, before China developed its own lithography machines, ASML's machines were outrageously expensive. When China was on the verge of developing its own lithography machines, ASML quickly lowered prices and engaged in dumping to seize the market, leaving no room for Chinese lithography machines. The so-called anti-dumping investigations against Chinese PV by the European Union essentially mean that European companies have lost their pricing power and can only rely on administrative intervention. In terms of fair competition, the European Union simply cannot compete with China. However, the European PV market is too significant, and they are unwilling to simply hand it over to Chinese companies. After the outbreak of the Russo-Ukrainian War, the European Union is determined to reduce its reliance on natural gas and vigorously develop PV generation. They have set a clear goal to double PV generation by 2025 and quadruple it by 2030. Increasing its share in the EU's energy structure to 45%. This means that in the next 7 years, the European PV market still has 4 times the growth potential. Such a large market, yet European companies are unable to capture it. What can be done? They can only resort to rogue tactics. That's why we see a Chinese PV executive being arrested by the German government as soon as they disembarked in Munich. In fact, the European Union's dependence on Chinese PV far exceeds its dependence on Russian natural gas. If the European Union loses Russian natural gas, it can still import from Norway, Denmark, the UK, Algeria, Qatar, and the United States. However, if the European Union loses Chinese PV components, the combined capacity of all other countries in the world cannot fill the market demand of the European Union. Banning Chinese PV would hinder the acceleration of the European Union's PV energy industry. By the time the EU nurtures its own domestic PV companies, China's PV technology will have already advanced. So, how did Chinese PV achieve a breakthrough despite the containment by the US and the West? It was during the World Solar Summit held in Zimbabwe in 1996 that PV power generation, as an emerging energy industry, officially entered the Chinese people's field of vision. At that time, China had just started the construction of the Three Gorges Dam, and remote areas in Tibet, Xinjiang, southwest China, and other mountainous regions still had nearly 100 million people without access to electricity due to difficulties in grid installation, population dispersion, and low cost-effectiveness. Flexible, cost-effective, and easy-to-manage PV power generation could perfectly solve these problems. Therefore, after understanding the advantages and disadvantages of PV power generation, China quickly cooperated with advanced PV industries overseas and imported multiple production lines for PV manufacturing, marking the beginning of China's PV industry's growth over the past 20 years. Photovoltaics is not only a massive industry but also a harsh market. Merely achieving the independence of the PV industry in China does not represent its true development. After entering the 21st century, China's PV industry encountered real challenges. The main challenge was how to sell Chinese PV products to other countries and how to make the Chinese PV industry stand out in the world, breaking through the blockade of Western powers in commercial competition. This would enable China to achieve profitability in the PV industry and ensure its stable development. To address this challenge and achieve this goal, around 2005, taking advantage of the global expansion of the PV industry, China seized the opportunity to go global. With competitive prices and reliable products, it quickly captured a significant share of overseas markets, dealing a heavy blow to established PV companies in Europe and the United States. This foray into international markets brought global attention to the Chinese PV industry, marking its first significant leap forward. According to statistics, by 2007, just 2 years later, the number of Chinese PV companies had surpassed 1,000. China surpassed Europe and the United States at an astonishing speed, becoming the world's largest PV manufacturing country. Since then, the global PV industry has entered an even more brutal competition. With the entry of Chinese PV products continuously driving down the cost of PV generation, the cost of PV power has been decreasing year after year. This has made more countries realize that PV power generation is not an unattainable Tower of Babel. However, China also naturally attracted the enmity of established PV powers in Europe and the United States. Chinese PV became a thorn in the side of the European and American PV industries. To suppress China's PV industry and regain lost markets, countries such as Europe and the United States targeted the weak points of Chinese PV, patents and raw materials. They launched a strangulation campaign against China, simultaneously prohibiting the export of raw materials to China and continually raising the costs of patent fees. They even outright prohibited China from using foreign PV patents. For example, to strangle Chinese PV, upstream manufacturers in Europe and the United States joined forces to short the price of polysilicon, a key material in PV production. This caused the price of polysilicon to plummet continuously for 12 consecutive months, resulting in heavy losses for Chinese PV companies. The global financial crisis that erupted in the United States in 2008 also dealt a heavy blow to China's PV industry. Under the global financial crisis, which was like a natural disaster, and the joint strangulation by established PV manufacturers in Europe and the United States, China's PV industry suffered severe losses. Within a year, more than 300 Chinese PV companies declared bankruptcy and were forced to be acquired by American companies. This painful lesson once again made the Chinese PV industry recognize a fact: for China to achieve true and peaceful development in the PV field, it needs comprehensive independence in the PV industry chain and PV technology. In 2009, the Chinese government officially approved the implementation of the China Golden Sun Demonstration Project, and invested a whopping 10 billion renminbi to boost the development of China's PV industry. At the same time, China timely announced energy subsidies for the Chinese PV industry, further reducing the cost of PV to rescue the market. These sharp and effective measures revitalized China's PV industry 3 years after the implementation of the Golden Sun project. In 2012, China's total PV installed capacity reached 3,432 megawatts. 66% of the world's PV came from China. This can be regarded as a miracle in the development of the global PV field. More importantly, under the strong promotion of the government, the PV industry in China has not only achieved breakthroughs in PV technology, reaching the world's advanced level, but also completed the entire PV industry chain, including semiconductor manufacturing, solar panel manufacturing, and power plant construction schemes. This has completely broken through the blockade imposed by the United States and achieved the independence of the PV industry. In terms of the number of patents, China has even surpassed the United States, which means that China is no longer afraid of the technological and industrial chain blockades imposed by the United States and Europe. At this point, the PV industry in China has lost any weaknesses. By 2018, over 200 countries worldwide had become customers of Chinese PV products, and solar panels from China were selling well around the world. The majority of the global PV industry had fallen into China's hands. China's participation accounted for 65% of various links in the global PV industry, and 80% of PV-related technology patents were held by China. In less than 20 years, Chinese PV successfully switched roles with the United States, becoming the undisputed global PV leader. It is precisely because of the magnificent development of China's PV industry that the cost of global PV power generation has continuously decreased, making the grand concept of desert PV a possibility. We mentioned this in one of our previous videos, so if you're interested, you can check it out. Okay, that's all for today. Please put your comments below and share your insightful ideas with other people. Your precious time with us is highly appreciated. See you.